welcome you to this AISA online event on technology and world politics. AISA online events aspire to harness the knowledge and expertise in our communities and open a dialogue within our communities, but also at a societal level. Technological change has always been part of international relations, but I think recent developments are unprecedented and raise renewed questions about how we understand power, sovereignty, influence, security. And I would say, I don't know if our guests today agree, but this is a household discussion, an everyday discussion about the impact of technology in politics or international politics, because it affects our everyday lives. So today's discussion asks, how do technological developments interact with the core concepts of our discipline? And whether or where do they complicate our existing analytical tools? I'm delighted to welcome a stellar panel, I would say, our speakers today, and would like to thank them for joining this conversation. I'm honored to welcome Rebecca Slayton, Associate Professor at Cornell University, Julia Calver, Postdoctoral Researcher at University of Leiden, and Andrew Liaropoulos, Associate Professor at the University of Piraeus. Unfortunately, Tobias Liebetrau couldn't make it due to a flu. It's the season, of course. And we will begin with a short question for all speakers, followed by brief individual interventions, and then we will open the discussion for a broader exchange. So my first question is, if you had to identify one and only one core IR concept that technology most complicates today, what would it be and why? I'll start with Rebecca.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you very much to Rebecca and the organizers of this panel. It's an honor to be part of it, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. I find this question challenging itself. I'm not so sure it's actually our technology that's disrupting our concepts as it is our discourse or our ideas about technology that are disrupting the concept. So I'll just give one example. Over the past 8 years or so, we've seen the rise of what gets called cyber persistence theory. And it's premised on the idea that there are these fundamental characteristics of cyberspace that create structural imperatives for states to pursue particular kinds of strategy and interaction. And the idea is that cyberspace is intrinsically vulnerable and resilient, and therefore states must constantly exploit the vulnerabilities of their adversaries and worry about defending their own. And so it's really grounded in kind of a determinist rhetoric about technology, the idea that intrinsic features of technology, whether it's vulnerability or resilience, create these incentives that necessitate particular kinds of behavior. And there's a certain logic to this, right? We do know that cyberspace is very vulnerable, and that maybe challenges some of our expectations for how we would expect states to act in cyberspace. But there's some problems with the premises of this, right? One is we can question the extent to which cyberspace is really inherently vulnerable, right? So with any technology, they're always products of social decisions, social choices. All technologies bring some kinds of power, other kinds of vulnerability. But again, it's ultimately the product of choices that people make. The technology does not just come out of nowhere, ex nihilo. So, why is cyberspace vulnerable in particular ways and not others? It turns out that there have been a lot of policy decisions that actually have led to the particular vulnerabilities that concern us today. Things like deciding not to regulate or to have any kind of liability for flawed software, incentives to just push things out as quickly as possible, decisions not to invest in a lot of security by a lot of organizations, which may be very well-grounded decisions, but they're not necessarily inevitable. They're a choice. So when we think about the way technology is and what kinds of activities it might be driving, we have to step back a bit and say, well, why is the technology that way that is creating these incentives? And second, even once you do have a technology that has a particular set of characteristics, in the case of cyberspace, it's very vulnerable space. There's different responses one could have, right? One would be to be very focused on offense and exploitation, which is kind of the approach of cyber persistence theory. Another would be to develop a more systemic approach to reducing vulnerability so that it's not like whack-a-mole all the time, which is the way it currently is. When you're trying to reduce vulnerability, it's just one after another. And so I just observed that it's not inevitable that nations necessarily focus more on offense than defense, or that strategies and concepts evolve in a particular way just because of a new technology. But the way we think about the technology definitely then shapes the response. So I'll just pause there and hand it off to my colleagues. Thank you.
Okay, the way we think about technology shapes the response. What do you think, Andreas?
I agree with Rebecca on the final point that the way we think technology shapes a lot of things. Regarding your question, if I had to constrain myself to just one, I would go with the concept of power, which for me, how we understand power, how we understand the power distribution relating to state, even non-state actors. I think that's the most central concept in my eyes. But very probably, if I may emphasize a bit on technology and many aspects of technology, we have information technology, digital technology, we have the label of emerging disrupting technologies, nanotechnology, etc., etc. And I think obviously they are affecting as every other technological revolution in the past, from industrialization to nuclear weapons. They are pretty much affecting many things, and they are forcing us as scholars and policymakers, not as policymakers, to rethink all those concepts. But I would like to emphasize on artificial intelligence, because I think it's a unique, in a way, case of technology. It's what we call in the literature the general purpose technology. It's like, in a way, like electricity or internet. It has a transformative effect because it pretty much affects everything, almost everything. I would say all sectors of society. It affects economies, it affects militaries, how we do or understand wars, security, etc. It affects institutions. It will affect, I suppose, even norm shaping, governance. And the way to very briefly illustrate this is, to, let's say, deconstruct the unique nature of what artificial intelligence is. And I have 5 points on that. The first is, and I'm sure we're all familiar with that, it's what we say the dual use nature of artificial intelligence. So basically, it's algorithms, it's codes that can be used for pretty much everything, from traffic optimization to medical research, but it can also be used for conducting cyber attacks, autonomous weapon systems, etc. So this dual use nature, it makes it difficult to regulate it, because you cannot have like one, let's say, pattern governance model that affects and applies to everything. So think of, and I know, Rebecca, you have done work on this as well, on nuclear weapons, nuclear materials. Okay, it's, let's say you want to regulate it, you want to control it. You cannot do the same with artificial intelligence, because it's basically data and code. I cannot go somewhere and investigate your nuclear facilities, right? So you have a problem in terms of, let's say, monitoring, containing or constraining certain things. And this creates verification challenges. For example, if we see the case of arms control, and it also raises dilemmas, ethical dilemmas about both civilian and military innovation. The second, in a way, not unique, but special, let's say, characteristic is that it has both a disruptive and a destructive potential. Same with many things in cyberspace. It could lead to kinetic attack as well, but it also has, in many ways, a disruptive potential. So artificial intelligence has a physical, but also information and psychological effects. I refer obviously to deepfakes, to generative text models, to algorithmic amplification that distort public discourse. We discuss about influence, about digital electoral interference, and about a key concept that has to do with trust. trust, mistrust, whether we lose trust to institutions, to the beliefs, to science in general. And in a way, it's not something new, but artificial intelligence makes those boundaries between, peace and war more blurred. We live in an era of unpeace, in this gray zone that it's not really clear whether we are under a situation of conflict, of crisis, of peace, of war. The third element, and again, it's something that can say a lot of things about artificial intelligence, because I see it as a force multiplier. At least now, let's say in the beginning, if we say that we're at least in the beginning of this era, it improves pretty much everything. Intelligence gathering, machine learning optimizes logistics. We can use predictive algorithms to make predictions to strengthen cybersecurity. And this, let's say, amplification of capabilities, this widens the existing power gaps. And it's to the benefit, of course, for those who have the computational, let's say, power and the data resources. Adding to that, we have at this, let's say, era, if I might constrain it a bit, we have the so-called first mover advantage. So states and companies that lead currently or will lead in the near future the research and control, let's say, the infrastructure in this area, whether it's China, whether it's the United States, they will not only gain economic leverage, but they will also be able to set the norms and the standards at the global level about what ideas should do or not do, how it should function. I call this like a form of, algorithmic dominance. So even in past decades, we were thinking about, okay, you're a great power. Why are you a great power? Because let's say you have nuclear weapons. So nowadays, we have to think also in terms of artificial intelligence. It's a race, it's a global competition, and this will define future power asymmetries and influence the balance of power. And my last point refers to data. We live in a data-driven world, data-driven economy. So the ones that really control and shape data are the ones that will have a benefit. And we can discuss about data sovereignty, data geopolitics. And my last point is, this is an example I also give to my students. I tell them in the classroom, I have to compete with Google, because I know that everything I say, you might probably Google it and say, okay, professor, Google says this or that. So, this is a simple example of the power of, algorithms, of data, and of the private sector, obviously, in the case of Google. So that was my first response, Rebecca.
Thank you, Andreas. And I agree that in the past also technology has affected international relations, international politics. But I think the difference today is what you highlighted in your last point, that today the whole of society is affected by technological developments, and maybe, I don't know if it is vulnerable because of them, or we see of technology as an opportunity. And I'm wondering what Julia thinks about it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again for having me. And I'm so pleased to be part of this very esteemed panel. Tough act to follow. I think some of my points were actually covered both by Rebecca and Andreas, so I'll try to kind of reflect on these in my remarks. My initial intuition was very much it resonates a lot with what Rebecca said already regarding technological determinism. I would conceive of technologies as being socio-technical in nature. And tech innovations, as has been mentioned already by the panel, have long characterized dynamics of IR. And this is an important thing to think about when we conceptualize or think about digital technologies vis-a-vis classical IR concepts. I actually also thought about the IR concept of power when I was asked this question, with sort of this socio-technical framing in the background. But I will now sort of reflect also, if I may, on the notion of space, because I think this is space as in not not as a domain, but space as in space and place. So thinking about how people conceptualize themselves in the world vis-a-vis others and vis-a-vis objects. Because already the panel has discussed what is cyberspace, what does political space mean? Are we now thinking about technologies in terms of a whole of society approach? So I also think space is an important dimension to the conversation that we're having. That being said, I did choose the concept of power, so I'll try to hopefully complement what Andreas has said by looking at two other dimensions of power. If I may, I think Andreas focused on sort of the coercive dimension of power in some of his remarks. I will now think more about and thinking about what Rebecca said, the productive power of socio-technological systems or socio-technical systems. And this asks us to pay attention to how discursive power is co-constituted by technologies and societies, and how, for example, expertise can be constructed through our interactions and our visions about technologies. And I think this is something that is also significant with digital technologies in particular, with discourses about the rise of big tech and who is shaping our understanding of the world. And I know, Andreas, you also mentioned sort of the power of Google when you're in the classroom, and I think this also plays a role. So the availability of information, how rapid this information is being disseminated across societies also plays a role in power relations. So thinking about for example, the development and the deployment of AI models, including generative AI like ChatGPT. On the one hand, it can reflect societal biases prevalent in earlier technologies, such as print media, photographic representations of certain groups of people or cultures, which are inherently biased and can reproduce power structures. But at the same time, our engagement with ChatGPT also feeds into and the data that we provide feeds into model development. And our visions for the use of such technologies also play a role. So what I'm painting as a picture here is that I'm not so sure that these technologies inherently call for a new concept in IR per se. It's rather that our engagement with them and our visions for what they might entail for society is shaping our understanding of them in the world. The last point that I'll make before we go into the discussion is thinking about the implications for state power, which is obviously a big theme in IR, thinking about the role of the state. And I think here it could be interesting to think about the literature on state building and state strength in terms of how we should think about states in the context we're describing. So, for example, a big theme, and this is where I'm coming back to the idea of space, is the concept of infrastructural power. And this is not a new concept by any means. We can turn back to Michael Mann, who conceives it as infrastructural power as the domestic capacity of the state to penetrate society and to implement logistically political decisions through the realm. And this encompasses both a state's capabilities, so its resources, and its effects on society, together with its territoriality. So again, thinking about the role of territory and space in the projection of state power. And I think it's an interesting framing because we often think about the power of digital infrastructures in more contemporary IR literature, but then referring back to this understanding also has a slightly more holistic approach, perhaps, of infrastructures that I think is very interesting. So again, this is kind of a pre-existing or older or OG notion of infrastructural power. But at the same time, and this is the last point I'll make, so thanks for your patience, the integration of digital technologies into core areas of state power, so how the state can penetrate into society, its relationship with society, and its territoriality vis-a-vis digital or virtual cyberspace, which transcends classical borders, asks us to reflect upon the role of actors in embodying state power or challenging it. And so that's what I think I'll leave. I think power as a concept has always been essentially contested. I think there are existing frameworks that allow us to consider what we're contending with today, but it doesn't mean that we should assume that the dynamics that were predicted by these past theories apply to today. So I think the concepts are still useful, but it does not mean that we will expect the same outcomes. And this is what I think we can see in the case of sovereignty. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Julia. And I will take what Julia said about infrastructure, capabilities, state power, as a point of departure to turn to Rebecca and discuss about cyber capabilities and defense and offense capabilities. Cyber operations are often described as favoring the offense, yet your work challenges this assumption, Rebecca. So how should we think about the offense-defense balance in cyberspace if we take organizational capacity and cost seriously? And what does this imply for states, particularly weaker states or smaller states seeking to defend themselves?
Great, thank you. So I'm going to actually briefly just show some slides because, apparently sharing is not sent on. I just sent a request to share. I don't have to use them, but I have them and I think they might be helpful. They'll help me certainly walk through things and they might help others as well. Let me try one more time. Okay, it's not sure, it's turned on. I can just also talk through this. Okay, now I think I can, nope. All right, why don't I just start talking through this? So basically, I think that the question of whether offense and cyberspace favors offense or defense is not quite the right question to ask. And I think a better question is under what circumstances do cyber operations favor the offense or the defense? And I think there's a prior question we have to ask, which is, what does a cyber offense-defense balance mean anyway, right? Because it actually often is used to refer to different things. I'm being told I can share now, so I'm going to do that just really briefly. I think it'll just make things a little easier to follow. Okay, so this is, let's go here, current slide. Okay, so this is what I just said, right? I don't think this is the right question. I think we need to ask the circumstances under which cyberspace favors offense or defense, and also what do we mean by the offense-defense balance? Okay, so there's at least three different concepts that you can find out there. There's actually maybe four. The really colloquial concept is people say, well, look, if you really want to get into a system, you can. So obviously the offense has the advantage. But the problem is that's not actually how we define offense-defense balance. At least historically, this is an older concept, and it's not just if somebody wants to enough, they can win. It's more has to do with costs and so on. So relative costs is one way that people talk about the balance between offense and defense. And this is just one example of this from Andrew Krapinovich, where he says that the cyber competition appears to be an offense-defense dominant competition. If both the attacker and defender are given equal resources, the attacker will prevail. Now, a second one is utility, right? So now it's not just what are the relative costs of offense and defense, but how much do I get when I attack something? And so you see this concept in this logic outlined by John Arquilla when he says, well, look, in 2007, these attacks on Estonia, they had a major payoff for the attackers and that they disrupted the government, but they were cheap. And therefore, he concludes the advantage lies with those who take the offensive. So that's a little different than just relative cost. There's a benefit being considered here. A third is third mover advantages, right? So the idea that offensive capabilities in cyberspace offer both the US and our adversaries an opportunity to gain and maintain the initiative so that you have a relatively greater advantage if you move first. That creates an incentive to move first and therefore creates an incentive to be on the offense. So these are really three different ideas out there. I think we need to be clear about which of these things we're talking about when we say offense has the advantage. I'd also argue that to understand any kind of payoff or costs about cyberspace and offense and defense, we need to kind of take information technology out of the black box. So it's not the case that information and communications technologies operate the same anywhere, independently of skill or organizational context. They require careful configuration and constant maintenance, right? Skilled labor. And companies more and more take on a lot of this, right? With auto updates and things like that. But still, Microsoft or Apple are not going to set up your printer and your network in the office. You're going to have to hire somebody to do that. You hope that they take security in mind, but maybe they don't. And then you have to have somebody that's constantly maintaining and fixing things when they go wrong. So it's a labor-intensive thing. It's not just a black box. And in cyber operations, then, the skills are the weapon, right? And so it's a very human-intensive kind of operation. So given that, it doesn't really, I don't think, make any sense to talk about the offensive advantage across all of cyberspace, right? You can only define it in relation to specific adversaries that have specific goals, things that they want to do in cyberspace. They have different levels of skill and organizational capability. And that balance, I would argue, characterizes adversary-defender relations, not all of cyberspace. So we can't really talk about the offense-defense balance of cyberspace as a whole. We have to talk about like who has an advantage in any given standoff. So that's basically the argument, right? It's not determined solely by technology. It's also shaped by the complexity of adversaries' goals relative to their skills and organizational capability. It's specific to operations, not a property of cyberspace. And the analysis of the balance has to consider, I think, not only cost, but also what do you get for this? Because that is what drives most reasoning about whether or not you're going to launch an attack. So I want to specifically address Rebecca's question about what this means for a poor. That's a crude way of saying it, right? But smaller, weaker, less resourced states. And if we believe that the difficulty of defense scales with the size and complexity of the computer networks to be defended, which I think is pretty conventional wisdom actually in the field, then it's not necessarily the case that smaller and less resourced states are at a defensive disadvantage if what they need to do has actually a smaller attack surface. If it's a huge state, of course, then it's less resourced. Now you're in trouble, right? But what they really need is to be well organized and capable. And that definitely takes resources. It takes trained people, skilled workers who are in high demand and need salaries. And it takes organization, which may take a certain amount of political will as well. But in principle, at least, if you're a smaller nation, organization, you should have fewer networks to defend, and it should be somewhat simpler. However, obviously, when it comes to being on the offense, if what you want to do is a really complex operation, something like, the U.S.-Israeli, actually turns out there's many states involved with the attacks on the Iranian nuclear facility, then it's going to take a lot more resources, and smaller states are not necessarily going to be able to do that. So there's definitely an asymmetry there in that case. But it certainly, I do think it challenges the assumption that was there for quite a while that cyberspace is this place that intrinsically favors weaker actors because it just takes some hacker in a basement to, bring down the CIA. And that's just, it's not what history suggests. It's not what our reasoning about the technology suggests. So I'm going to stop there and pass it off to someone else. Thank you. Have I stopped sharing? Let me get to stop sharing. Right there. Okay.
Thank you. So much, Rebecca, for the interesting points. And I want to turn to Andreas and from the power perspective, go to the influence perspective. And influence has always been central to international politics. But as you already implied, AI-driven tools seem to affect, to alter the levels of influence or how influence operates. So my question is, do AI-enabled information operations fundamentally change how we should think about influence, or do they intensify existing dynamics in different or in new ways?
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. It's really interesting question, and I like that you use the term influence. Over the past years, I mean, I have done some work on propaganda, strategic communication, information operations, and the latest trend is influence operation and cognitive warfare. Everything in NATO is obsessed with cognitive, so we have new terms out there. So in order to really answer your question, in the so-called influence literature, there is a popular concept. It's called the ABC framework. A stands for actors, B for behavior, and C for content. So in order, let's say, to demonstrate what artificial intelligence is doing in terms of the so-called influence business, we can think it in terms of actors, behaviors, and content. Regarding the first one, actors, it's a reality that it significantly lowers the cost and technical barriers to conduct this sort of operations. In the recent past, and we still have social media that have reduced the expense of reaching, larger audience. But with artificial intelligence, it automates content. It helps us in order to create fake personas, cultural tailoring, making influence campaigns more scalable and harder to detect. And this cost reduction broadens also the range of potential actors. So it enables both state and non-state actors to outsource this sort of influence operations to private firms. So there is a whole influence industry out there. You can make a fortune, by the way. And by outsourcing to so many actors, it provides plausible deniability. The same with cyberspace. It's a very common, let's say, concept. And we have seen it in the case of Russia and the many influence operations they have done. They have used private firms, in some cases, like proxies. So when we have the issue of plausible deniability, we have the problems of attribution. And if attribution becomes more difficult, then it also complicates accountability and the way somebody responds, the state or the national organization. In terms of the second acronym, B, it's deception. In our case, it revolves about deceptive behavior. And mainly, if we look at the large language models, they represent a major shift by replacing or augmenting the human writers. Their use dramatically increases the scale, and at the same time, it reduces operational risk. Because if you have less humans, it can look like a more safe, secure operation because less people are involved in this sort of, let's say, influence campaign. Artificial intelligence tool can support mass messaging, long-form content, and cross-platform testing before they disseminate this message. They enable highly targeted persuasion by generating tailored messages based on demographic data. That's something that we as humans, at the bigger scale, we cannot really do. So concerning the last aspect, which is, let's say, the content, it enhances both the generation and the dissemination of deceptive material, deceptive content. And it allows influence actors to collect vast amounts of human-generated data, which can then be reused to mask bot activity, to train generative models, and replicate organic behavior. They can, large language models, but also other, let's say, tools, they can generate persuasive text comparable to human-authored content, imitate linguistic and cultural styles, which we cannot do, as authors, as whatever, and it can even avoid, classic human errors. So, in a way, we have seen influence in the past with many tools, let's say conventional and digital, etc. It's a new business. It brings a lot of tools out there, and it forces us to rethink not what influence only is regarding how big, how important it is, but I think there is a shift from persuading beliefs to shaping behavior and gaining attention. And this, at least in my mind, this moves influence in the IR context closer to governance, to social control, social engineering. Look at the Chinese social credit system, or the digital dystopia, rather than just communication where we have seen it with, let's say, typical other means, with typical propaganda. So that's it as a first response.
Thank you, Andreas. And we talk about power, influence, and I guess the last side of this triangle is sovereignty. So I want to turn to Julia and discuss digital sovereignty. And these days it has become a powerful concept in Brussels and elsewhere. I wanted to ask, what does this gap or differences between discourse and practice tell us about how sovereignty is being reinterpreted in the digital age, or adapted, let's say, in the context of technological conditions?
Great, thank you. Also a great question, and I think you could spend a long time talking about this, but I'll try to keep my remarks brief. So at the bottom line, digital sovereignty can mean a plethora of things in practice. I think in some ways it's useful to frame the discussion by first going back to classical definitions in IR of sovereignty and then moving into the practice. The other thing I would say up front is that you can have a gap between discourse and practice, and this is not inherently a new issue for digital sovereignty either. But I think I would agree that digital sovereignty practices and behavior are very interesting and somewhat, yeah, an interesting characteristic of the current age. And I'll leave that there and go into more depth now with my remarks. So sovereignty, as we know, is a core political legal concept, establishing the basis of rule for states in the international system, if we adhere to Krasner's definition. As a term, it has its meaning, and who has exercised it has evolved over time in IR, who can claim sovereignty, from the monarch being the sovereign to the state being sovereign. And nowadays, we've seen the rise of sovereignty claims being put out into the world, not only by state actors, but by organizations such as the European Union. It's also cropped up in strategies written by the African Union. And we also see it being branded as a product to some extent by big tech actors who have offered sovereign clouds. So digital sovereignty as a concept has a lot of different actors and practices attached to it, you might say. Conventionally, sovereignty as a concept in IR encapsulates both an internal and an external dimension. On the one hand, it's the assertion of exclusive authority over a bounded socio-political space, and the legitimization of this claim through mutual recognition. That would be both the internal and the external sides of sovereignty in theory. But in practice, this is often more of a messy behavior or reality. But sovereignty in that sense can be also broken down as both a discursive representation of space, being a naming practice or a claim over a certain space, and in terms of being a material spatial practice that underpins world politics, because sovereign states have more rights, for example, in international law than states that are not recognized as sovereign. So it has both discursive and practical elements. But there is a strong performative dimension that I'd like to focus on here. And traditionally a territorial dimension. And this is something that I already spoke about in my first remarks, but the question of territoriality and sovereignty in the context of the digital domain is much more fuzzy and fluid than perhaps you would associate it with in a physical, purely geographic physical domain. But of course, the digital domain also has physical layers or links. So it's not a clean separation from our previous understandings of territorial sovereignty and now digital sovereignty. There are underlying infrastructural elements that also complicate this picture. So moving on to whether or not sovereignty is then redefined in the digital age, given that I've just painted quite a complex or messy picture of what sovereignty is. There's a variety of ways that you can answer this question. You can look at sovereignty as an international legal concept, whether or not digital sovereignty or the digital age challenges this definition. I would argue that that is less the case. The internet does not impinge as much on state sovereign equality under international law. But on the other hand, an area in which it has more, it appears to have more, technologies appear to be more disruptive is in the area of domestic sovereignty, again, to refer to the Krasnerian framework, which is sort of the state's role and having the exclusive control over within its borders, and interdependent sovereignty, so the ability of the state to control its borders. These are much more disrupted and complex, you could argue, by the digital sovereignty concept. And this is made clear when we think about Europe and the European context at the EU level, in which you have actors which are supranational, such as the Commission, the European Commission, advancing claims to digital sovereignty, and it featuring as part of Ursula von der Leyen, so the current commissioner's digital agenda in 2019, and that sort of goal towards achieving digital sovereignty emerging as quite a strong linchpin of the current digital decade agenda advanced by the Commission. And the real question is, what does this actually mean for the EU, which has both pooled sovereignty between member states, but also this growing, increasingly assertive role of the Commission, which also claims to be geopolitical in nature. So in this sense, you see quite a complex picture of what it means then to have European digital sovereignty. And I would argue that it's not only European sovereignty in terms of national states, but really this goal to articulating European digital sovereignty in terms of projecting the EU's claim to authority over the whole EU bloc and positioning the EU as a geostrategic actor vis-a-vis the US and China. So I'll just pause there for a second and think about how then that how we can think about supranational actors as digitally sovereign, and how they can actually pursue digital sovereignty through practices. And if you look at the EU again, you can think that this is quite challenging for the EU because it has to negotiate different levels of sovereignty and different interests across the bloc. And this is one reason for why digital sovereignty in practice, compared to the claim, you can often see a gulf between the rhetoric and the reality. One more thing that I'll touch upon that further complicates this picture, including in Europe, is the use of or the promotion of sovereign clouds by private actors. And this has also given rise to questions about sovereignty washing. So, for example, if national governments agree or they decide to sign a contract with big tech, non-European big tech firms to provide them with sovereign cloud, how does that fit, one, under the European digital sovereignty agenda at large, but two, into these member states' claims to trying to protect their own sovereignty? So you see these different levels of sovereignty playing out, and questions about what it actually means to have a sovereign cloud and what is being protected here. And what claim over space is being made also in terms of the infrastructure and the data space that this cloud, the sovereign cloud, is aiming to protect or control. So if sovereignty was what states make of it, to use the Wendtian framing, then perhaps the construction of sovereignty at the level of popular discourse, in which we're currently seeing in Europe, is now broadening to other actors, and it's becoming more shaped more strongly by private big tech actors. And this is partly due to their growing role in providing core functions that states rely upon because of the reliance on data and cloud for enacting things like healthcare at scale. So in our datafied society, we might see digital sovereignty claims diversifying and becoming more further complex. So to close, is it possible to have digital sovereignty? I think again, it's really about digital sovereignty is almost in the eye of the beholder. So I already discussed how big tech providing sovereign clouds to European states, that really raises questions about the definition of sovereignty in the digital age itself. And you can also think about this in terms of policy trade-offs between openness and control. So, but I'm happy to go into that in the Q&A because I know I've spoken for some time already. Thanks.
Thank you, Julia. We can open now the Q&A part. We have a couple of questions about digital sovereignty on chat. Yes, Andreas, I'll give you the floor in a bit.
Okay.
And I'll give also Julia a couple of minutes to follow up with the questions. But before that, and before giving the floor to Andreas, for his follow-up, I would also like to harness the power of the chair and share also a question, one more question. If you were advising a policymaker today, what is the most important analytical mistake they should avoid when thinking about technology and international politics? Julia said sovereignty is digital sovereignty is what we make of it, or it is in the eye of the beholder. Rebecca stressed that the way we think about technology shapes our response to the challenges. So what should policymakers avoid? And Andreas, the floor is yours for your follow-up, I understand, but also for a response to the question. And everyone can place their questions to the Q&A box, and we will try to answer them all.
Actually, I just wanted to comment on what Julia said, if I may, for a minute. I really like the interpretation of sovereignty. There are so many things to discuss. First of all, about the term. It's data sovereignty, cyber sovereignty, internet sovereignty, information sovereignty, etc. I'm not going to go into this. But Julia said a lot about the EU. I mean, in my analysis, I use very often a comparison between Russia, China, and the EU as different, case studies of how they conceptualize, obviously, sovereignty, whether we put digital or not. And it's really interesting because semantics are important. Both the Chinese and the Russian use the term information. They don't refer to cyber, meaning that all this is about, in the end of the day, about information control, etc. If you see the doctrines, information security doctrine, whatever, information operations. So they think in sovereignty terms, mainly in terms of information, whether that's the classical data or digital data or any sort of data. And with the EU, I cannot resist to the comment like, we have difficulties about understanding EU sovereignty. So if you put digital in there, it gets even more complicated. But again, it's a different example of authoritarian model, let's say, about China, Russia, whatever, Iran, any other case study, and a different example about what the EU is trying to regulate, the Brussels effect, and many other things. And I apologize for the time I'm taking, but there are many things to think, because Julia said about territoriality, I think Rebecca as well. Think about data localization, how states are trying to become sovereign, to exercise some sort of power by doing data localization, or even cyberspace fragmentation, whether RUNET nowadays is a case of a sovereign, closed internet in a way. So that's it. Sorry for this. I didn't think of your question, to be honest. hard enough. So I'm going to
What
pass it to
your
somebody else.
intuitive answer would be?
Sorry?
What your intuitive answer would be? Just one mistake, maybe.
Oh no, this was my comment to Julia, to be honest. Okay, to your, I think that what I would advise a policymaker is not to, let's say, to throw to the recycle bin all the traditional understanding of the concepts we do. So yes, it's new, it's technology. We always in that position we think, oh God, it's something new. I have to, rewrite whatever my textbook of policy making. So I would say the concepts, the theories are out there. They're really useful. You have just to understand them and make an interpretation in, let's say, technology data-driven environment. So many things have changed, but not everything has changed. So that's what would I advise my policymaker: stick to the basics, and we have, in a way, the toolbox to make sense of the world nowadays as well.
Rebecca?
Thank you. Yeah. So I think I would say that we need to resist the assumption that we can't change the form that technology takes, right? So I've talked about technological determinism. There's different kinds of technological determinism. One is the idea that we have to conform ourselves to whatever technology emerges. The prior one is the idea that technology is just going to go in a particular direction and we can't stop it or affect it. And I'll use the case of AI because it comes up again and again, and it's such an important case. So I'm really glad that Andreas brought it up. But there's many kinds of AI. AI is not a single thing, right? Machine learning even is not a single thing. And but there are very powerful forces in the private sector, right, to paint a vision of this is the inevitable way that it will go and that it must go. And it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy to the extent that you can get investors to believe that and then give them money to push these projects out, which are incredibly capital intensive, right? But there's nothing inevitable about that. These are decisions being made to push these massive data centers and so on out there without even knowing what we're going to use them for entirely, right? But these things can take different forms. They can have different kinds of applications. Policy should have a role in shaping them. I don't think they're entirely unregulable. Yeah, I mean, I think that policymakers need to be thinking about what do we want AI to do for us, and to remember that they actually can shape it to some extent, even just to the extent of like land use policy. How many gallons of water are we going to allow these things to consume? How much are we going to allow them to contribute to climate change? All of these sorts of things are policy decisions, and it's not inevitable that it should go in one direction or another.
Julia, and if you want to follow up also on the questions on the Q&A part, because they are both about digital sovereignty. Of course, if Andreas and Rebecca, if you want to follow up to the questions on the Q&A box.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope I'm recalling the question that you posed correctly, Rebecca, about what would I advise to policymakers about avoiding kind of technological like fallacies with respect to tech, and how to contend with these issues. Is that right? Okay. Sorry, I was reading the questions in the chat, which I will also get to.
Yes, you are absolutely right.
So thank you for that. Yeah, I concur with what my co-panelists have said already. I think a key thing is not to get. I think it's one to be aware of also the fact that it's not just tech that shapes our understanding of tech. So sort of following up on Rebecca's points, we should not just kind of give the reins over to the experts who are removed from politics. We should ensure that there are pathways to hold them accountable, but also I think there's a strong emotional dimension to new tech sometimes. So it's also speculating what this tech might mean. There can be anxieties around tech, and it's important to be open about that, not just kind of respond anxiously to the potential emergence of tech. So it's also thinking about that in terms of also in terms of AI. So what kind of future do we want? Not just allowing the menu of options presented to policymakers to shape the choice, but also some form of deliberation. So I would just leave it at that. I think I don't think we should throw away our old concepts. I think they can be useful for helping us to understand these issues. Getting to the questions, I will only answer the first two. I just saw there's a third, but I haven't had time to read that yet. The first question, as I understand it, is also about not only different competing conceptions of digital sovereignty between states, but also between social movements or revolutions or revolutionaries or people and governments. And I think that's a really good point regarding how you can have the state using digital surveillance to enforce, or so that therefore maybe their position of power as a sovereign to suppress social movements, but also having the role of technology as enabling or empowering revolutionaries. I think this also points to a really important underlying point that sovereignty is not just necessarily tied to the state, although we tend to think about this when we think about IR. You can also have indigenous sovereignty as a potential way of thinking about digital sovereignty, and this has been written on by. There's been a few nice papers written about this recently. So thinking about digital sovereignty in terms of self-determination, being able to articulate and form a legitimate claim over a certain territory or group. So it's not by any means confined to the way in which states frame it. And that points back to the discursive side and the power relations underlying sovereignty claims. And I think to Andreas's point, he also highlighted how different states even can conceive of cyberspace or the space over which, or the objects or subjects over which sovereignty is being claimed in this case. So it doesn't. So again, I think it's important to make distinctions about that and not take digital sovereignty as a monolithic label here. For example, there's been a paper recently written about how local knowledge and participation can inform digital sovereignty practices in Africa, following the Ubuntu principles, which is the notion of personhood being reinforced through communal relations based on generosity, compassion, and friendliness, not necessarily a classical Westphalian framework of sovereignty in the state. So that's a potential alternative framing. Getting to the second question about the role of the UN in the digital sovereignty sphere and holding big tech corporations accountable. I think you can separate these questions into two, actually. So thinking about the role of the UN in digital sovereignty, I think it's hard not to think about, in some ways, the gridlock in the UN about the role of the state in governing cyberspace. In the UN, there were for a long time, there were two working groups, one in which was being sponsored by states who supported the multi-stakeholder model. So that's not necessarily states that were promoting digital sovereignty and kind of the outsized role of the state in governance, but also incorporating non-sovereign actors into international cybersecurity governance. And you had the multilateral model that was being led by China and Russia, who, as Andreas mentioned already, were at that point promoting their versions of cyber sovereignty or information sovereignty. So I think to some extent the role of the UN in this digital sovereignty circumstances are already fraught by this fragmentation between multi-stakeholder, so involving non-sovereign actors to the table, and this multilateral approach. So I think even bringing in digital sovereignty as a claim into this mix would be something that would be perhaps not in the diplomatic interests of the EU. But this is all said with the caveat that I'm not an expert in the UN. The other question about big tech corporations, holding them accountable at the international level, it's an amazing question. I would love to hear your view, so the poser of this question and the view of my panelists, because I think it's really challenging, for the reasons I've just outlined in the UN.
Thank you, Julia. And we already have one more question about the big tech, and there's a long intervention, I would say, with many questions. If I can summarize it, our attendee wonders whether we need to change our state-centric concepts because of the influence of the big tech and the role of the big tech. So I'm going to start with Andreas. I don't know if anyone else wants to intervene on this question, and we have one more and maybe last question about technological capacity and organizational capacity. I think this one goes to Rebecca. The basic question is about small states, and in what extent does organizational capacity matter more than technological capacity for small states in cyber operations in general? So I'll start to Andreas and then to Rebecca, and I don't know if Julia, you want to also follow up.
Okay, I'll go. I'll pretend that I know the answer. I actually have an idea to be honest with you, I'm developing over the last couple of years, and it's not something new, but it's a complex idea about a digital social contract. There has been the discussion out there. So up to a point, it highlights the sovereignty, how we can regulate, do some power balance with the private sector, all those digital champions out there. So I think a way to think forward into all of things, whether it's, and again, the digital social contract is different, for example, in case of the European Union, in case of China, in case of Russia, of any other understanding, whether it's closer to Hobbes, to Rousseau, or any other interpretation. So I think that in the coming years, we have to think and discuss whether we will put the private sector and the digital platforms as a player, as a key player in our interpretation of data, of sovereignty, of security, and whether we consider that there should be a triangular relation between states, citizen, people, and digital platforms out there. So I don't know, it's still vague in my head, to be honest, but I think maybe that's the way forward, to balance all those things and move away from the classic Westphalian state-oriented interpretation, and think that, okay, we still have states, and I'm sure we're going to have for a long time, but we do have another entity, the private sector, the digital platforms in this case, and if we live in a data-driven society world, we might kind of incorporate them in this, discussion and power balancing.
Yes, and I think this is a very interesting and wonderful idea to have a digital social contract. But we have also one more question, which asks about authoritarian regimes. And I think when you talk about a digital social contract, you talk about democratic states. What about authoritarian regimes? What's your view on it?
I think authoritarian regimes have a simpler understanding of things, convenient to their needs, to their necessities. So they will more or less, understand and have an interpretation on everything about national security, about regime stability, about everything. So it goes under being sovereign in terms of regulating data, regulating the people, not only the infrastructure, but even, controlling all these dimensions of cyberspace, whether it's the infrastructure, whether it's the code, whether it's people, or actually data, and via data also the people. So it goes to, the case of Russia, of China, of Iran, of social credit system, of every form of digital authoritarianism that we've seen from the Arab Spring until the latest cases.
Thank you, Andreas. Rebecca?
Yeah, so this is fascinating, and I love these questions. And I want to take just a tiny liberty to address the ones that have just been getting discussed because I think they're really important. One of the ideas that I found really helpful and interesting is Swati Srivastava's notion of hybrid sovereignty, right? The idea that it's not either states or corporations, but it's the way that they work in cooperation with each other. And I think obviously the tech sector is becoming incredibly influential, but they still are reined in by states, right? I mean, you see that in the United States, you see that in China, you see that around the world, that they can be, there's a balance of power, for lack of a better phrase, right? So I really like Andreas's idea of a social contract, and I think we have to think about what are the common interests of all these actors. And there are common interests. Most states, even authoritarian ones, don't want to have rampant crime in their country because they want to be in control, right? So, there are common interests. All governments should have some interest in stopping climate change, right? Which the digital sphere is having an enormous impact on, particularly with cryptocurrency mining and so on, right? There should be some common ground there. Not saying that that's easy to find or even to convince states, governments that this matters, including my own current government. The authoritarian states are also not static things, right? They come and go. So, we have to think about how common interests continue even as governments change and states' authoritarianism rises or falls. So the question about organizational versus technological capacity, I'm a little bit struggling to understand. This may sound silly, but I'm a little bit struggling to understand the question because I think of technological capacity and organizational capacity as being kind of two sides of the same coin, right? So maybe by technological capacity, what we mean is that there's a bunch of corporations out there that we can outsource our problems to, as opposed to having our internal organizational capacity. I don't know if that's kind of what the question's getting at. But technology, of course, is always built by organizations. They need material as well, right? Natural resources. But it's accomplished by organizations, and it gets better to the extent that those organizations are well organized and resourced and managed. So I'm not sure that I can assign a higher priority to one or another. I do think there's an interesting question about what any given organization trying to defend itself can do from within versus what it can outsource. So one of the ways that a lot of smaller states actually try to either do surveillance or offense is by hiring companies that can do it for them because the National Security Agency, they buy their vulnerabilities sort of on the side when they need to, but mostly they develop them in-house. But if you're a small state and you don't have that in-house capability, you hire, one of these surveillance companies, or maybe one of the misinformation companies that Andreas was mentioning, right, to do your work for you. And I think that gives you a different level of control over what you're able to accomplish. And, a lot of the countries that end up trying to do that, sometimes they make mistakes with the capabilities that they acquire because they don't really have the in-house capability to use them. So I don't know if that fully addresses the question, but I hope it touches upon it a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Julia, some closing thoughts?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I found this discussion really fascinating. I think I'll try to attempt this really interesting intervention by the anonymous attendee. I kind of following on a bit what Rebecca said about hybrid sovereignty. In my remarks, I also mentioned pooled sovereignty, and which is a sovereignty that's being pooled by EU member states for the purposes of European cooperation in a variety of different policy domains. But that even points to the fact that, the notion of perfect state sovereignty, depending on whether or not you subscribe to Stephen Krasner, for example, is that it is organized hypocrisy. So sovereignty as a term itself is contested. It's not just that just that it's limited to a very circumscribed view of sovereignty, that it has to be this perfect claim over a very clearly delimited territory. But there's lots of different approaches to it. So in that sense, I would push back on the argument that sovereignty as a term is irrelevant. And indeed, we have also, by the mere fact that we've seen sovereignty claims emerging, not just by state actors, but by supranational actors, superstate actors, depending on how you would conceptualize the EU, and by private tech actors. And I think it's worth thinking about sovereignty as a term, and not discarding it. So it's worth reflecting on how sovereignty as a claim draws upon older notions of legitimacy and power, and at the same time might be seeking to reconstitute what it means in the digital age. I think it's a very fascinating thing to look at. But I think this question is also pointing to this point. So hasn't the state fundamentally transformed in the new era? And I think I would also respond to that by saying that the state itself as a unit of analysis is not monolithic. The state has evolved over time, also in terms of or in tandem or in co-construction with technologies. What we think of as the nation state, I guess going back to modernism, we're now in the postmodernist era of states. We're in a globalized era of states. So I think it's also worth thinking about that the state itself is not necessarily a static entity fixed in time, but it's how we think about it. So I don't know if that really satisfied the point, but I think there are a lot of really interesting questions being asked there. Although I would still defend the value of thinking about what sovereignty means, but we should not just place digital sovereignty in a classical framework.
Thank you so much, Julia. I guess the conclusion is our concepts are alive and well, but a little bit challenged, maybe. I want to thank everyone. I want to thank especially our speakers, Rebecca, Julia, and Andreas, and everyone who joined the discussion. Stay tuned for our next events on January. And until then, happy holidays to everyone, I guess.
Thank you. Happy holidays, everyone.
Thank you all. Happy holidays.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Take care.